the time the agreement was being negotiated, hunting was becoming increasingly difficult for Cree people because of the difficulty of assembling the cash needed. The fur prices were declining. The governments were restricting access to social programs in order to get Cree to give up hunting and take on jobs. But what was surprising in the negotiations, again showing the importance of context, was that addressing the cash and socio-political needs of the cash needs and the socio-political needs, context of that cash in the agreement was not a major conflict. One of the most unique provisions of the agreement, an income security program for Cree hunters, was not contested. In fact, it was readily adopted in the preliminary discussions before negotiations began. And that was both a benefit and a problem, but I've wondered why. And the reason, I think, which sounds enormously strange today, is that government programs for guaranteed annual incomes to the population at large were being discussed in the 1970s. This is a far removed space from the world of social programs today. It was so serious that in New Jersey and in Manitoba, the governments of Canada and the US mounted test programs in which a whole city was given guaranteed incomes for several months to see how it would work. And in Quebec, the commission headed by Claude Castonguay on the health services and social services commissioned a study on income security and how it could work in Quebec. So these were all forerunners of the issue coming up in the agreement. And everyone accepted that there should be an income security program for the Cree if they wanted it. The problem was people had an idea of what kind of a program it would be. And that was not what hunters needed. It was what urban-based workers needed in their families. And so the detail of negotiating the income security program was really about the details of designing a program that could work for land-based, long time in the land hunters for whom the settlements were not their primary home. That involved legal matters, for example, not making it like a welfare program, giving hunters who wanted to benefit the legal right to benefit, which welfare recipients don't have. Setting up a program that was administered jointly with the government, but with full decision-making, joint decision-making, making all of the local staff almost Cree, and adapting all of the features of the program to the timing and the needs and the activities of hunters. Probably the greatest area of difficulty was the cost of the program. The governments were afraid that the program might be abused by people, even though they insisted on fairly strict access rules, but rules that were negotiated to be workable at the time. But they wanted some assurance it would not just explode without a limit. And they estimated in their work that there might be 600 beneficiaries, that is, single hunters or hunting families on the program. In something I found quite extraordinary, the Cree community leadership, the councils of each community, made lists of people, talked about what they knew about hunters. Hunters were out on the land when this was being negotiated, many of them, and came up with a list of 1,017 beneficiaries. Governments and even some people on the Cree side thought it'll never go over 700. But there was enough disagreement that the government put a cap financially on how much could be spent. You may be interested to know that after the first year, there were 1,012 beneficiaries registered, 5 less than the band councils had estimated. So the program had an effect, and it's been renegotiated twice. Again, it's a program that has worked surprisingly collaboratively, expressing both its social function and the spirit and the intention in which it was set up. I can only briefly talk about what's happened since the negotiations. Those were the main conclusions in the area I worked. 1,000 families and hunters received hunting benefits the year after the agreement was signed, starting the year after the agreement was signed. The research that's followed 10 years after, 25 years after, and what the Cree see is that Cree tenure and hunting territory governance have continued under periods of very dramatic changes because of forestry and because of a number of regimes of financial assistance to people who have land. And that's a major area on which the Cree are working now. It's an area in which outside governments and corporations' intervention has disrupted that governance to some degree in the most exposed areas. But on the whole, Cree governance works, and Cree hunting leaders are in the process of developing responses to it, including the development of a Cree hunting law. And in the communities I know, local leaders work very intensively on hunting land conflicts and problems. So it remains an area under Cree control and under Cree development, but it has become much more complicated than was envisaged at the time of the agreement, but not because of the intervention of the agreement, because of developments in the area that affect land. The question of negotiated rights has become an area of serious breakdown. In the years following the agreement, the rights that were negotiated were largely ignored by the government. Cree hunting continued, vitalized by the income security program, but the control of government and its attempt to intercede in hunting activities was not effective. Philip Washer has some very powerful statements on that in his 25-year review of the failure of respect. And Cree, the consultative and coordinating mechanisms set up by the agreement, have also not effectively worked. Government has largely used them as rubber stamps for most of the year since the agreement. I haven't followed the course of that in detail, but I spoke recently to some of the Cree leaders involved, and they see shifts occurring in that under new forms of government mentality, I would say, a greater openness to decentralized decision-making that I think is affecting the way the agreement is being negotiated. I'll talk about that a bit later. But so the agreement in the areas I work, I'll just talk about the income security. The income security is largely the area where it's worked, although not without needing significant changes and needing them still. But the agreement increased the number of people hunting from about 700 to about a bit over 1,000, the number of families and individual hunters. It increased their time on the land by one third, and it outfitted them and allowed to go to more distant areas. And it did so in ways that they were in control of how they used the money, so that in large measure, it reproduced the social relationships and the social institutions of hunting and being on the land. So that program, along with the strength and growth of the Cree national governments and the growth of the communities and the settlements and their self-management under the agreement, have created a much stronger Cree political and social and on-the-land presence since the time of the agreements, but not without massive disruptions and failures of the relational processes. The lessons of James Bay, it was not an agreement. It was an agreement very specific to a very specific time and place. It was negotiated under threats of a hydro project with massive consequences, and it was rejected immediately by other indigenous peoples. But there have been a lot of discussions over time as the negotiating scenes have developed, not to go back to it, but about what can be learned from it. Many of the newer negotiations are moving to a very different arenas of negotiation, particularly negotiations where indigenous people don't depend so much or so extensively on legal rights recognitions and administrative co-governance recognitions, and more into doing it and having the economic resources to do it themselves. And that's reflected in the subsequent agreements of the James Bay Cree, and it's reflected in indigenous nations movements across many places, although there's an enormous range of views about whether that's what the balance should be. In the Cree world, the new communities have been built. People's lives have been greatly improved. Their control is now much more in the hands of their own community governments, called First Nations governments, and their Cree Nation government. And Cree and local regional leaders are starting in some quite surprising ways to have some decisive effects on the land after years of complete failure to build that relationship. Some hunters have been able to influence the way the Rupert River diversion, or part of the Rupert River diversion, was built, so as to alter the impacts on their lands, and in their view, agreed to that part of the diversion that covered their lands for the benefit of the rest of the community and its need for employment and job opportunities. There have been extensive talks over the last decades about turning forestry to a management system that is based on clusters of Cree hunting territories. Although I must say we're still waiting for that to work, and it's part of a larger project of whether Quebec will control its forestry industries or not. But it's interesting to see that as the discussions have shifted, some of the things that were important at the beginning of the agreement are back on the table in new and different ways. The period of negotiations, as I mentioned, was extremely intensive. And after completing my PhD and getting my degree in 1979, I was at a moment of decision myself. My sense at the time was that it had been a very unique experience, and that it would be useful to document and share it with others. Professional colleagues, people involved in indigenous struggles, indigenous peoples themselves. And so I took a decision not to continue to work as a consultant to the Cree or to become what would certainly have developed quickly into a staff position with the Cree, but to return to academia at McMaster. And starting actually on the postdoc. And I published a series of articles just trying to convey a sense of the agreement. I haven't talked about those a lot now because they're of a certain period and time, and only parts of them still speak to situations today. But they were about strategizing. I published them in Canada, the US, Australia, Europe. They were on the institutional and programmatic structures, the legal arrangements. I responded to requests for specialized reports from a few indigenous peoples and took up some opportunities to talk in Australia, Alaska, as part of a project of just sharing that experience and letting people make what they would of it in their own work. In 1978, an interesting part of that developed as I started to turn to anthropologists, because I took up an invitation to go to the hunter-gatherer conference that was being organized by Maurice Godelier in Paris in 1978. It's interesting, I've spent a fair number of visits to Paris since then and have taken some sabbaticals at the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale when it was under the direction of Claude Lévi-Strauss and under the direction of Philippe Descola. One of those created an interesting moment. I was in Paris in the early 1990s during the struggle against the Great Whale hydroelectric project, when there was some pretty strong debates going on in and outside of Quebec over the Cree attempt to stop, an Inuit attempt to stop that project. And I was in Paris sort of trying to keep up to date on these things at a distance. And I got a phone call one afternoon from Brian Craik, an anthropological colleague who works for the Grand Council of the Cree, now for the Cree Nation government. No, for the Grand Council, still for both. And Brian said to me, how are you? I said, where are you? He said, we're in Paris. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm here with Romeo Saganash. I said, my goodness. He said, would you like to join us for dinner? We're going to see Paris from the Seine on a boat, on a cruise boat. I took up a wonderful opportunity. And during the evening, Romeo explained why he was there. He said that, would you like to join us? Tomorrow we have a meeting with Lévi-Strauss. I hadn't met Lévi-Strauss until that moment. I said, of course. And so there's a kind of first irony that it was the Cree who introduced me to Lévi-Strauss. There's also a kind of history here because Billy Diamond had gone to see the Pope during the earlier period of struggles. So I didn't try to make the equivalents too close. But Romeo explained that there was a sense that some of the opposition that was developing in Quebec and some of the language, not only in Quebec but in Canada as well, was becoming racist. And they felt that the Cree were trying to think about how to address that before it went too far, and how to present the alternatives and give impetus to the alternatives and call people to stand up for the alternatives. And the idea they had was to ask Lévi-Strauss if he would speak out on the question of racism in French in Quebec. And he listened to the situation very carefully. There were, I believe Emmanuel DeVoe was there also in that meeting, if my memory serves me right. And his reaction was an interesting one in that he said he was too old to really travel, he felt, for that. But he was willing to speak to the issue, which was an interesting response from him. And he left it with the Crees with Romeo and the Cree to decide when and how they wanted him to speak, and then to set for him the situation in which he could make a contribution. It was a very satisfying meeting, I think, for the Cree. And it turns out that they never did ask him the form in which the fight over Great Whale developed. I never really asked for an explanation, but I think some of the hottest moments not calmed down, but were taken over by a series of changes. I think the project became more and more complicated at the moment for Hydro-Quebec as time went on and financing became more tricky. I think we were in the lead up to the election of the PQ government in Quebec. There were many things that led to a kind of defocusing, maybe, of that kind of confrontation. At least that's my hypothesis. And so I didn't get the chance to meet Lévi-Strauss again in Canada. But let me go back to the 1978 meeting. It was an important meeting, I think, because it was part of a set of writings I did and discussions I held with colleagues and actions I was involved in with others around the theme of anthropological engagement. How does it get put on the agenda? How does it need to be called to attention? How can it be used and challenged in ways where there's disagreements about its use? And in 1978, there was a large Canadian contingent at the Hunter-Gatherer Conference in Paris, all of whom were talking about the ongoing rights and struggles of the people they were working with. Michael Ash, Michael Ash, Serge Bouchard, Paul Charret, Raphael Picard were all there. And each of us in our own way spoke about things that were not being talked about by other speakers on the whole. I remember being very frustrated at the tone of the conference, which was still really about hunters and gatherers as if they didn't live in the modern world. Not about their economies, not about their relations about their economies, but not about the relations of their economies to markets and about to governments on the whole, with some exceptions. It created enough of an impact, our different presentations, that the last evening of the conference was reserved to an additional unscheduled session. I chaired it, and all of the people I've mentioned spoke at that session as the lead-off to a more general discussion among people working, among hunters and gatherers. Among the themes that came up in these presentations was a questioning about a remembrance that the Man the Hunter Conference had really created an image of hunters as 3 million years of human history, and that we as anthropologists had taken hunters as connected to the past, and that much of the public attention that work and that very exciting work got was taken up in the public as hunters, as representatives of our past. So that there was a need to really shift the paradigms within the discipline and beyond. The shift occurred in the conference from the Paris conference, which was called Politics and History in Band Societies, and it was edited by Eleanor Leacock and Richard Lee. In my article at the conference and there, I wanted to show that first, contemporary hunting societies now had different forms of productive organization, access to consumer goods, complex technologies. I mean, it was striking when the Canadians talked about hunters and gatherers using airplanes to go out to the bush in that conference. The only possible parallel, I think, at the time that was mentioned was some of the assistance to hunters in Australia to get out to reserve lands. But it was interesting, these kind of issues started to arise. We also talked about addressing these issues requires new analytical frameworks. Frameworks that were not common in hunter-gatherer studies. And in some ways, it was not clear what anthropological models to apply quickly and easily to them. So it raised wider issues for anthropology. There was good work going on in analyzing governments, their policies and their practices. And that, of course, has developed very richly in the decades following the 1980s, which could draw on this. But this needed to also focus on how people surviving interacted with those. Not only how they were constrained, but how they sought to maintain autonomy and control. And there was also some notice to the way anthropologists were being called on to do new things. We were being involved as Michael Ash in the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, Paul Chardet with the Innu, myself with the Cree, to talk about new ways of relating to government, if we could, to talk about shifting economic dependencies, to evaluate, discover, and create means by which peoples and societies could enact and take action to change relationships to government and to change national and international arenas if they had to, as the Cree were doing shortly after. These calls implied, although I don't think I articulated it at the time, also questioning the separation of applied anthropology and the rest of anthropology. The kind of things that all of us were doing, you were doing both in the same activity, in the same work, day to day, in the same meetings. And the separation didn't make sense. The theories that were about economic systems and were part of theoretical academic anthropology had to be used and thought about in relation to remaking relations to markets. And remaking relations to markets had implications for some of those theories about how subsistence systems are production systems and productive systems. The Cree had been struggling with many of these images, of course, themselves, and that we called attention to also. They had been struggling with images of part of the past, of disappearing, of not having a currency and not having political presence. That led me to some work that was part of the hunter-gatherer conference on the politics and history of band societies. But that connection with other hunter-gatherer specialists led me to start looking at hunter-gatherer theories. And I was surprised to find that as I engaged the theoretical side of hunter-gatherer studies, one of the main points of theorizing was how to define the difference, the radical separation between hunters and all other human societies. It was motivated in part by the evolution of modes of production and the development of those analyses, but it was an issue in social analysis more generally. So it was very much a part of what was happening in anthropology in the 1980s. I looked at Claude Mieyasu, who, using the work of Colin Turnbull on the Mbuti pygmy, a work that was quite captured a particular moment, made temporality into the central defining feature of the self-sustaining mode of production of hunting bands, as he called it. Drawing on his ethnography, Turnbull's ethnography, he pointed out that hunting mode of exploitation is discontinuous. You go out on hunts of limited duration. Each can be sometimes independent each of the other. The product is obtained immediately at the end of each venture, not over successive hunting ventures. The activities led, he thought, to a way of life that was focused on the present, without any duration or continuity. He called it an instantaneous way of life that hunters lived. He constructed so radical an opposition or characterization of hunting societies that he said he couldn't imagine a transition to farming. And he concluded that hunting may be unable to develop into any other mode of production. Hunters thus not only lived in this kind of framework without a sense of time, but without a future. They did not produce a real future, a future with potential to be anything other than what they were already. The analysis caused lots of debates, and it caused me some worry. Tim Ingold initially offered another alternative, asserting that the distinctive features of hunter-gatherers was that social relationships have the character of immediacy as opposed to production. That in a sense, people are not dependent on specific relations to other people for access to basic requirements, because there's free access for everyone. Ingold later revised this point. But these anthropological models, both of time and of sociality, deny that planning and everyday change are occurring, and that they're essential to the effective action and roles of hunters in history. I challenge this with a general ethnographic model. I talked about Cree elder hunters who tell stories about their important hunting experiences. And many younger Waswanipi people, this is from the Waswanipi long stories, learn about these stories not just as personal tales, but as part of their education as hunters. Both the stories and the models of reciprocity they incorporated are communicated to the youth in contexts that show how to be effective hunters, how elders became effective hunters. And young men mentioned that when they hunt, some young men mentioned that when they hunted with elders, they had better hunts, that listening was making a difference, hearing the stories was making a difference. And they themselves often were very concerned to establish themselves as good hunters, to establish good reputations, which depended on the elders recognizing them and how they were developing as hunters. So there was a complex relationship going on. The stories, interestingly, were also mobilized to young people who had been to school. And I, as I listened to them, thought that hunters, when they talked about spirits sharing insights, animals being persons, communications, how the hunt communicated between a hunter and an animal, and both were communicating with each other. I came to understand that they were talking against common white men knowledge about what the kids had learned in school. So the comments were a way of showing Cree youth that the world in the bush was not the one they had been led to expect in their schooling, that it really, you couldn't understand its complexity with the kind of natural science teaching that went on in the school system. You had to think about harvests as gifts, about reciprocities with spirits, and about weather persons. So there was an assertion about social relationships and about the future here that seemed to me to reject the whole idea of instantaneity in either. This was about the reproduction of hunting societies and about their reproduction precisely through their ability to think of futures and to engage outside changes in history. So it generates a set of social relationships that are very close to the social relationships one encounters in any human society. And so that was my presentation in an article on those arguments. I kind of thought of it that Waswanipi has to remind anthropologists that people are temporal and social, and that they're embedded in process and history.